Hi there, I'm Dr. Sam Curtis, and today I'm going to be talking about my own experiences with gestational diabetes. So, especially as first-time moms, there's a lot of anxiety about the stuff that you have to do to keep on track, right? Like, you typically go in for your first ultrasound, your dating ultrasound, which lets you know your due date. From there, you have your regular appointments once a month, and then at 20 weeks, you have your 20-week ultrasound, which is your anatomy scan to let you know that everything is going the way it's supposed to go, and that at that point, if you would like to find out the sex of your baby, that's when you would do that. Around 28 weeks for most American women, you will be given a drink called a glucose drink, and you will usually do a 1-hour glucose test. Usually you go in, you're fasting, they take your blood sugars via blood, and then they will give you a drink, you drink the drink, and then at 1 hour, they take your blood again, and they test your blood glucose. And a lot of women will pass that test just fine, and then some women don't. And then from there, the follow-up is they'll give you a 3-hour glucose test, which is where you show up, you've been fasting, they take your blood, you drink a drink, it has more sugar in it than the previous drink, and then you will be tested every hour on the hour for 3 hours. And then from there, the decision is made as to whether you have gestational diabetes or not. And of course, from there, regardless as to whether you have gestational diabetes or not, you continue on with your care. You have your regular appointments. Usually at 39, 40 weeks, they're gonna do another ultrasound just to make sure the amniotic fluid is good, making sure the baby's head down, yada, 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 yada. And then from there, you have your baby. So an increasing number of women at that special 28-week mark are being told they have gestational diabetes. So, as far as the research shows, there's nothing that an individual can do to prevent gestational diabetes. Gestational diabetes is a presentation of intolerance to, or insulin intolerance during pregnancy only, and it's usually related to the placenta. There's some interesting correlations. So essentially, you're more likely to have it if you are carrying a boy. You're more likely to have it if you are overweight. There's a couple of precursors, like for instance, if your A1Cs are elevated before you become pregnant, then it's more likely that you'll become insulin resistant when you're pregnant. So there's a couple of key factors that let us know it might happen, but really there's no way to predict. So here is what I have to tell you about gestational diabetes. These are things that I had no idea, and I consider myself to be exceptionally well informed. Humility, I wasn't. Number one, your fasting numbers. And fasting numbers are frequently the issue that people have the most issue with. Different people have different parameters for what is considered high, but most people will say anything over 95 or anything over 100 is considered high. Now, if you don't have gestational diabetes and like in a normal person, you want your fasting numbers to be like 70s, 80s. But for gestational diabetes, the big considered unregulated or irregular high glucose at fasting would be over 100. Again, consult with your obstetrician on what they say is high. It's different for everyone. So, and then from there, they're gonna have you do what they call postprandial readings. And you'll do that with an at-home glucose monitor. Usually it's provided by your insurance or at least partially covered by your insurance. And then you just check your blood glucose 1 hour after a meal and 2 hours after a meal. Most of the time, at a certain point, whether it's initially or after a couple of weeks, your OB will actually only ask for one or the other of the postprandial readings. And that kind of makes things a little bit easier. Otherwise, if you're sticking yourself 6 times, 7 times a day, your fingers get a little sore. So essentially, your postprandial numbers can be really easily influenced by what you're actually eating. Lily Nichols is one of my absolute favorite resources. She has a Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, Real Food for Pregnancy, and she's a nutritionist who's kind of bucking the system when it comes to the typical advice for gestational diabetes. There are a lot of government-funded programs that will help you determine nutritionally what is best for you. I say do what you think is best. There's a really great resource on evidence-based birth about how to interpret different numbers and how to influence them. If you ever have any questions about that, just email me and I'm happy to send you those links. And then really what I wanted to focus on for this conversation is going to be the fasting numbers. Fasting numbers are hardest to regulate because you're not eating. You can't say like, oh, I'm just gonna change what I'm eating to influence them. There is some suggestion there that if you eat higher protein, there's the Brewer's diet as well as Weston Price. They're eating two different methodologies that can reduce your glucose levels. However, here's one of the biggest things that I learned. Your fasting blood glucose is not meant to be more than 12 hours. So for instance, that would mean that you would eat dinner at, let's say 7 p.m. That means that you need to be up and testing your blood sugars no later than 7 a.m. So I don't know about you guys, but that's not really what I did. So when I was pregnant, what I was doing is I would eat dinner at like 6:30, and then I wouldn't eat anything else all night. Then I would wake up the next morning at like 7. And then by the time I got situated and was ready to test, it was like 8 o'clock. That's almost 14 hours between testing windows. So the very first thing that I learned is that if I go in and I actually test in that 8 to 12 hour window, so like I eat dinner at 6:30, I had a bedtime snack, usually a high protein, literally if it's just like a couple of pieces of chicken. I was a big fan of protein shakes because they were low sugar, high protein. And then I wake up the next morning, whenever I wake up, it's ensuring that I'm not going more than that 12 hours. And without medication, my blood glucose really dropped dramatically. It took me down into like the high 80s almost immediately. So making sure that fasting window is narrow enough, and then also what you're eating. Personally, I'm not a snacker. I did not enjoy snacks. I still don't really like snacking very much, but that quarantine life has got me eating a lot of snacks. So it was difficult for me to consciously say, okay, it's time for a snack. However, doing that, really just harping in on making sure that I had that protein shake around 10 o'clock at night, right before I went to bed. Finding something that doesn't give you heartburn is another big thing. But that protein shake really brought my numbers down almost immediately. I showed the numbers to my obstetrician and I was like, hey, look, I think this is working. And he was like, okay, cool. Let's try to wean you off of the metformin then. And I did, and it worked really, really well. As far as your postprandial numbers are concerned, you have two options. Depending on where you are body-wise, weight gain-wise, all that stuff, this is sort of a decision that needs to be made between you and your doctor. But the other big thing that you really can consider is the size of the portions of what you're eating versus the content of what you're eating. I'm certainly not here to shame anyone. I don't think that's appropriate. But I recently was talking to someone, not a patient in the office, it was actually on a social media post. And she said, oh, I love my waffles and syrup for breakfast, but my postprandial numbers are like 190. And I'm thinking to myself, why would you continue to eat the waffles and syrup if your postprandial numbers are so high? And she's like, well, I really like them. So at that point, I say you have a couple of options. In my mind, because I don't want the complications of gestational diabetes, I'm going to say I'm just not going to eat those things. However, even within that realm of cravings, because pregnancy cravings are real, what if instead of doing a waffle and syrup, you did a waffle and peanut butter? Or you did a waffle with anything else other than straight maple syrup? That's a good option. Or if you really want that waffle syrup combination, taking like a fourth of the waffle and maybe a fourth of the syrup and then eating some eggs to go along with it. I think something that I really am a fan of that I didn't quite recognize beforehand, and there's actually, if you go to Lily Nichols' page, she just shared an article about this, and this is, so we know that like low carb diets are correlated to lower blood glucose. However, they found that different people have different blood glucose spikes to different foods. So for me personally, I found that I could pretty much eat like a white sweet potato with every meal, and it did not affect my blood glucose at all. 1 tablespoon of steamed white rice, I shot through the roof. It was insane. So I think if you're concerned about gestational diabetes, kind of playing around with your numbers before you get pregnant is one thing to consider. Things will change in pregnancy. As I said before, gestational diabetes is a product of placenta, not of you. You are not broken. Your placenta is not broken. It's just it's a variance of normal. So those are my big things that I kind of learned when I was pregnant about gestational diabetes that I never really thought of before. So what I'm planning to do in the future, and yes, I would love to have more babies. Hopefully I can look back at this in a few years and be like, and she did have more babies. Is I really think that Lily Nichols is on the money when it comes to the nutritional content of the food. Personally, when I was pregnant the first time, one of the most difficult things that I experienced was someone telling me to just eat healthier. And at the time, I was very poor and I did not have the availability to eat better than what I was eating. I was eating as good as I could. That being said, the content of the food that she recommends, really just sticking to like hearty soups, bone broths, making sure that you're eating a good meat. She still incorporates a fair amount of carbohydrates. I think she's just brilliant. I'm kind of fangirling over here at the moment. I do know a couple of people who have done not necessarily extreme low carb, but lower carb while pregnant, and they've had good results with that as well. But the other big takeaway is incorporating a high protein snack right before bed. I did, like I said before, I did chicken a couple of times at the recommendation of a friend of mine, and I'm a really big texture person, and for some reason at 10:30 at night, grilled chicken just was not doing it for me. So I personally chose a protein shake that was pre-mixed. Again, texture, I don't really do well with slimy things when I'm not pregnant. When I was pregnant, it was way worse. I personally chose Premier Protein. There's also Orgain, which is pretty good, depending on how you feel about artificial sweeteners. To me, it was all about getting those numbers down. I felt like that was paramount as far as my own health was concerned, and that was what helped. So if you guys have any questions, please let me know. I'm pretty much just going to send you to Evidence-Based Birth or Lily Nichols pregnancy books, but I'm happy to help in any way that I can. This is something that's really close to my heart, considering I had a very healthy pregnancy. I think I gained like 14 pounds my whole pregnancy. I was active, I was working, I did all the things right, and I still had gestational diabetes. So it's something that when I hear it, I always want to be like, you're okay, you're okay. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and I would love to help, send you at least in the right direction. All right, thanks guys.